Hello, good day. Good day to everyone. Sir Howard here. Pag-uusapan natin ngayon yung napakahalagang topic in the field of cognitive psychology, and this is called cognitive neuroscience. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng cognitive neuroscience? This is a field that studies how thinking processes are connected to biological elements of the body. Kinulayan ko ng pula yung mga mahalagang salita: field, thinking processes, and biological elements. So, pag sinabi mong field, ibig sabihin, pwede kang mag-masteral dito, pwede kang mag-PhD dito, pwede kang mag-specialize in the field of cognitive neuroscience. Pero, sa Pilipinas, wala akong alam na program na nag-o-offer ng specialization in cognitive neuroscience. Kinakailangan mong pumunta ng abroad because we don't have the toys of cognitive neuroscience. Para kasing maging magaling na cognitive neuroscientist ka, you need a lot of technologies para mas maging malalim yung pagkakaalam mo about this field. Unfortunately, sa abroad lang yan present, so you have to travel abroad if you want to specialize in cognitive neuroscience. And then, ang pinag-aaralan dito is thinking processes in connection to the biological elements. So, ang pinag-aaralan sa cognitive neuroscience, nilink natin kung ano ang kinalaman ng ating pag-iisip sa mga biological elements ng ating pangangatawan. If you remember, in cognitive psychology, ang focus natin dito yung cognition. Ibig sabihin ng cognition, yung takbo ng pag-iisip. Paano ba tumatakbo ang pag-iisip ng tao? Bakit ganyan ang takbo ng pag-iisip niya? That's cognitive psychology. Pero kung gagawin natin cognitive neuroscience, ililink natin yung mga biological na nangyayari sa ating pangangatawan doon sa takbo ng pag-iisip. So in cognitive neuroscience, we believe that there is a very strong relationship between kung ano yung mga nangyayari sa ating katawan sa kung paano mag-isip ang isang tao. Ganon ang tinatawag nating neuroscience approach. And paano ba natin pinag-aaralan yung takbo ng isip ng tao, which is cognition, sa mga biological processes sa ating katawan? We study the brain. Naniniwala tayo in cognitive neuroscience that the brain is the hardware of thinking. Yung thinking process kasi, kung paano ka mag-isip, bakit ganyan ka mag-isip, yun yung software. Memory is a software. Your ability to learn is a software. Pero what makes those softwares possible, yun yung hardware. And in cognitive neuroscience, yan yung brain. So, pinagpapalagay natin na yung mga pangyayari sa utak, which is the hardware, merong kinalaman yan sa software ng ating pag-iisip, also known as cognition. So, ang tanong, paano ba natin pinag-aaralan yung brain para mas maintindihan natin yung cognition ng tao? We use the following techniques. Okay? Una, gumagamit tayo ng tinatawag na post-mortem studies wherein we study the brain of deceased individuals. Ang approach dyan, hahanap tayo ng grupo ng mga tao na merong psychological condition. Halimbawa, Alzheimer's disease. So, hahanap tayo ng mga taong may Alzheimer's disease and we wait them to die. And then, after they die, we open up their heads, examine their brain, and we compare their brains to people whose brains don't have Alzheimer's disease. So, kapag ginagamit natin yung approach na yan, ang dami nating natututunan about a certain condition, lalong-lalo na yung Alzheimer's disease. Like for example, dito sa screen, kitang-kita natin na iba ang utak ng taong namatay from Alzheimer's disease versus people whose brains are normal. Literal, ang brain kapag may Alzheimer's, lumiliit yan, gumagaan yan, kasi ang mga brain cells ng Alzheimer's disease, mabilis ang pagkakamatay compared to people whose brains don't have Alzheimer's disease. Kaya kapag may Alzheimer's disease ka, literal, your brain is shrinking. At merong mga cognitive consequences yan. Kapag yung brain mo paliit ng paliit because of Alzheimer's, nawawala yung iyong mga cognitive abilities. Nahihirapan kang umalala ng mga pangalan, nalilimutan mo yung mga skills na dati-rati naman na kayang-kaya mong gawin dahil nga sa iyong Alzheimer's disease. One very popular research area in the field of post-mortem studies, itong ginagawa sa mga Mankato nuns. Mankato is a place somewhere in Minnesota. Merong isang kumbento doon wherein the nuns have signed a document na kapag sila ay namatay, they are donating their brains for scientists to study. And a lot of these nuns, meron talaga silang Alzheimer's disease. So kaya nila dinodonate yung brain nila para makatulong sila sa pag-intindi kung ano ba yung mga mechanics ng Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is a very interesting series of studies. Marami na tayong conclusion na nalaman about Alzheimer's disease, but one of the most important learnings na nakuha natin from the Mankato nuns about Alzheimer's disease is yung brain pala natin is following the use it or lose it principle. Ibig sabihin, kapag yung cognitive processes mo lagi mong ginagamit, the brain maintains that cognitive process. Pero kapag yung cognitive processes mo bihira mo lang gamitin, hindi ka lagi nag-iisip, hindi ka mahilig mag-isip, yung iyong mga cognitive activities hindi ganun kadalas mong ginagamit, then you lose the cognitive abilities na kayang gawin ng brain mo. Kaya nga, going back to the Mankato nuns, marami sa kanila, according to the study, namatay sila na meron na silang full-blown Alzheimer's disease. Pero, shortly before silang mamatay, kung titignan nyo yung kanilang cognitive performance, mukhang hindi lumalabas yung simptomas ng Alzheimer's disease. And the answer, bakit ganon? Kasi maraming mga nuns doon sa kumbento na yan, very cognitively active. Nagsosolve pa rin sila ng puzzle, nagbabasa pa rin sila ng libro, nanonood pa rin sila ng mga educational shows. So, yung brain nila nakakagawa ng mga new neural connections, kaya nababawi nung mga new neural connections na yon yung epekto ng Alzheimer's disease. Sa English, ang tawag dyan, buffer. Nagkakaroon ng buffer yung brain against the negative effects of Alzheimer's disease. Kaya ang isang conclusion dito, talaga ang utak, mas lumalakas yan habang mas ginagamit ng tao. Paano natin nalaman yon? Because of doing post-mortem studies. Pwede rin naman tayong gumawa ng animal studies. Ang ginagawa naman dito, as obvious naman sa pangalan, pinag-aaralan natin yung utak ng mga animals for us to get conclusions how the human brain works. So, pwedeng pag-aralan mo yung utak ng aso, pag-aralan mo yung utak ng pigeons, pero ang pinaka ginagamit talaga sa cognitive neuroscience na utak ay yung utak ng mga daga. Because a lot of cognitive neuroscientists believe maraming mga similarities, no, in brain functioning yung utak ng daga at saka yung utak ng tao. Now, because of the rats, marami tayong natutunan about how the human brain works. For example, by opening up the heads of rats and studying their brains, natuto tayo ng maraming mga lessons about how memory works, how learning works, or even how hunger works. Ang mag-focus na lang ako dito sa hunger because we don't have enough time to focus on learning and memory, no? Pero isa sa mga classic studies on hunger is yung ating appetite pala sa pagkain, it is a cognitive ability. It is a brain activity. Saan nanggaling yung conclusion na yan? From the sham eating study. Ewan ko lang kung narinig nyo na itong study na ito, but in this study, there are 2 rats. Yung control group, hinayaan lang yung mga rats. Ito yon, yung sa kaliwa. Pero yung mga rats sa kanan, ito yung sham eating group. Binutas yung tiyan ng mga daga. So, nangyayari, itong mga daga na to, habang kumakain sila, habang umiinom sila, their food goes straight to their stomach and straight to the container na palabas ng stomach. Ano nakita ng mga cognitive neuroscientists? These rats never stop eating. Patuloy pa rin na kumakain yung mga rats. Ang tanong, bakit? Doon nila nalaman na meron palang special function yung brain sa pag-signal kung kailangan na ba nating itigil yung ating pagkain. Napag-alaman ng mga cognitive neuroscientists based on this study that the brain is constantly monitoring the weight of the stomach. Kapag yung stomach na-achieve na niya yung certain weight o yung bigat, the brain will sense this, and that's the time that the brain will release neurochemical signals to the body to stop eating. Kaya yun na yung panahon na feeling mo busog ka na, yun na yung panahon mo na parang nasusuka ka na kung kung ipagpapatuloy mo pa yung pagkain, and so as a consequence, titigil ka na sa pagkain. Kaya ang malaking lesson dito, hindi lahat ng tao na ayaw tumigil sa pagkain dahil yan sa kanilang character problem. Masyado silang matakaw, hindi ganon. Kaya ayaw nilang kumain, posibleng merong mga neurochemical problems na nangyayari inside their bodies. O, di ba nalaman natin yan sa pamamagitan ng animal studies. Now, in more modern cognitive neuroscience, napakauso na rin yung paggamit ng brain scanning techniques. Ang disadvantage kasi doon sa dalawang approaches na nauna, masyadong invasive, di ba? Hahanap ka pa ng ulo, bubuksan mo yung ulo, tapos pag-aaralan mo kung paano gumagano yung utak, masyadong invasive. So, cognitive neuroscience gumawa ng paraan para makagawa tayo ng mga technology where we can study the brain even without opening a single skull. Yun yung tinatawag nating brain scanning techniques. Una dyan yung EEG. Sa EEG, ang ginagamit natin dito is electrical activity. As you know, yung brain natin may mga electrical activities yan. So we can learn a lot of things about the human brain simply by analyzing how these electrical activities behave. Like for example, isa sa mga sikat na research area sa EEG study is sleep studies. Marami na tayong nalalaman sa pagtulog ng tao na resulta ng ating EEG studies. Like for example, alam natin na ang pagtulog ng tao ay mayroong mga different stages yan. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, and rapid eye movement. So sa isang gabi, pag natutulog ka, paikot-ikot ka lang sa mga stages na yan. You enter Stage 1, then Stage 2, then Stage 3, and then rapid eye movement, that's where you dream. And then after a certain amount of time, you are in REM, you go back to Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, and then you enter REM again. Which explains why it's possible for one night, habang natutulog ka, marami kang panaginip na napaniginipan. Kasi paikot-ikot ka lang sa mga stages na yan. Paano natin nalaman lahat ng to? Because of EEG recordings. And also nalaman natin na sa bawat stage ng sleep, iba-iba ang behavior ng electrical activity of the brain. Gumagamit din tayo ng CT scan. Sa CT scan naman, gumagamit tayo ng radiation para makabuo tayo ng picture ng brain inside a person's head. Okay? So, yan yung tinatawag nating CT scan, gumagamit ng radiation. Iba naman yung PET scan. Ang PET scan, hindi tayo gumagamit ng radiation, rather, we analyze how the brain consumes glucose. Ang assumption, kapag sinilip mo sa PET scan yung brain, kapag nakita mo na yung parte ng brain na yon ay gumagamit ng maraming glucose, then the assumption that part of the brain is the most active. Pero para magawa mo yung PET scan ng maayos, meron ka munang dapat i-undergo na proseso. This is where you will be injected with a radioactive tracer. Para itong biological ink, no, na kapag in-injection sa katawan yan, dediretso sa utak yan, and that's the only time that the PET scan machine can analyze glucose consumption. Iba naman yung MRI scan. MRI, makakakita tayo ng 3-dimensional view of the brain. Diyan mahina yung naunang dalawa, no? Yung PET scan at saka yung CT scan. Sa PET scan and CT scan, yung image ng brain dyan, limited lang 2-dimensional lang. But in this method, the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, 3-dimensional. Merong length, merong width, merong height yung image ng brain na pwede nating makuha. And also in MRI scans, ang ginagamit dito is magnetic field. Hindi tayo gumagamit ng radiation dito, no? It's all about magnetic field. Ngayon, meron pang mas advanced sa MRI. Ito yung tinatawag na fMRI, where we can analyze the brain activity of the person in real time while it's doing something. Kung baga, ang MRI, matindi yan kasi picture yon ng brain, 3-dimensional, mas matindi ang fMRI. Kasi ang fMRI is taking a video of your brain while the brain is at work. So, ginagamit ito sa mga iba't ibang laboratories. Merong ipapagawa doon sa mga tao habang naka-fMRI, and the fMRI machine can record the behavior of your brain in real time while that person is doing something. Ngayon para lang mas specific, ang fMRI sa sobrang tindi niya, ang ginagawa niyan, nakikita niya yung blood flow that's happening inside the brain. Nakikita niya kung saan dumadalo yung dugo, saang part ng brain pumupunta yung dugo, and the assumption, yung part of the brain kung saan dumadalo yung dugo, kung saan pumupunta yung dugo, that is the part of the brain na active given a certain activity. Like for example, marami ng mga fMRI study na ginawa to study the brain of a person who is sexually promiscuous. Specifically yung mga tao na mahilig manood ng pornography materials. What did they find out? Very interesting. Kung ikukumpara mo raw yung brain ng mga tao na addict sa porn versus sa mga tao na hindi addict sa porn, malaki ang pagkakaiba ng kanilang brain. Para doon sa mga porn addicts, yung kanilang ventral striatum, that is a very small part of the brain, considered as the reward center of the brain, nagiging active yan when the brain is anticipating rewards, especially sexual rewards. Yung mga porn addicts, yung ventral striatum nila, laging naka-on, laging naka-switch on, hindi siya nag-off. Kasi ang normal state talaga ng ventral striatum, it needs to be on and off depending on situation. Kasi ang tao hindi naman dapat all the time sexually aroused eh. There are appropriate times where people are sexually aroused and when they are not. Pero doon nga sa mga utak ng mga taong mahilig sa porn, the ventral striatum is 24/7 active. Kaya yung mga taong sexually promiscuous, lagi silang may gana, mataas ang sex drive nila regardless of the situation. Sexually aroused sila sa birthday party, sexually aroused sila sa simbahan, sexually aroused sila sa habang naglalaro ng sports, laging naka-on yung kanilang ventral striatum. And they're saying, cognitive neuroscientists are saying that one reason bakit nangyayari yan is overstimulation of the ventral striatum through watching pornographic materials. So the more you are feeding your brain with sexual stimulus, the more you are giving strength to the sex drive. Sa sobrang taas na ng sex drive na binibigay mo sa brain mo, dumatating na sa point na yung ventral striatum mo parang nag-short circuit at hindi na siya napapatay. Lagi na siyang naka-turn on. Kaya ang story dito hindi talaga maganda na ang isang tao ay na-addict sa pornographic materials. So after everything na diniscuss natin on how to study the brain in cognitive neuroscience, merong isang pinakamalaking contribution ang cognitive neuroscience in understanding the human brain, and that is the modularity view of the brain. Nalaman natin because of all these studies that specific parts of the brain specialize in certain functions. Let me repeat, specific parts of the brain specialize for specific functions. Before cognitive neuroscience, akala kasi ng mga tao, whenever we do something, lahat ng parte ng utak natin gumagana. Hindi pala ganon. No? Depende sa ginagawa mo, merong certain part of the brain ang nag-handle nun. Merong certain part of the brain ang nag-i-specialize doon. Now, don't get me wrong. Hindi ko ibig sabihin na kapag nagsusulat ka, one part of the brain lang yung gumagana sa'yo. Lahat naman yan gumagana pa rin. It's just that there will be one part or set of parts of the brain that specialize in the action of writing. Okay? So, hindi equal yung brain activities whenever we do something. Merong mga parte ng brain na talagang nag-i-specialize when we do a specific behavior. Paano natin nalaman yan? Because of cognitive neuroscience research. At yan na yung magiging foundation ng biological psychology. If you study this subject, isa yan sa mga part ng curriculum ng subject na yan. Yung teacher dapat maipaliwanag sa mga estudyante yung link between certain parts of the brain and certain psychological functioning. Kaya isa yan sa mga hirap na hirap ang mga estudyante mag-memorize. I-memorize mo kasi yung mga parts of the brain kung anong function yung hinahandle ng mga parts of the brain na yon, no? Okay. Now let's move on to this very important topic, the question of the century in the field of cognitive neuroscience. Marami nagtatanong, given all the examples that I have shown you, does that mean that the brain shape cognition? Ibig sabihin ba lahat ng takbo ng ating pag-iisip can be explained by what's happening in the brain? Ang sagot sa tanong na yan is very complicated kasi ang sagot niya is yes but not always. Let me repeat. Does brain shape cognition? The answer is yes but not always. Okay, bago tayo malito dito, pupuntahan natin yung dalawang yan. No? Punta muna sa yes and then but not always. Bakit yes? Base naman sa mga examples ko, no, talagang makikita natin na yung mga pangyayari sa brain, meron siyang mga cognitive effects. Halimbawa, sa biopsychology, napatunayan ng mga biopsychologists na maraming mga biological effects in our nervous system na nakakaapekto talaga sa takbo ng ating pag-iisip. Like for example, increases in serotonin. Kapag yung serotonin mo tumataas, nagiging klaro yung pag-iisip mo. Mas nagiging mabilis mag-isip, no? Mas nagiging creative yung tao. That's based on many studies. There is a link between high serotonin levels and high levels of creativity. Paano ba tumataas yung serotonin when you exercise, especially under the sun? Kaya meron talagang wisdom behind exercise. Kung gusto mong mas maging maayos yung pag-iisip mo, mas maging klaro, mas maging creative ka, you need to exercise, especially under the sun because that's the best way to increase your serotonin level. O, di ba? Something biological which is serotonin, merong epekto sa ating cognition which is creativity. Sa DevPsych naman, one example from DevPsych, yung teenage brain. Napatunayan na sa DevPsych na yung utak ng mga teenagers very different from the brains of children, from the brains of adults. Napaka-unique ng utak teenager. Specifically, yung mga brain centers responsible for reward seeking during this time napaka-active. At kasama na nga dyan yung sinasabi ko kanina na ventral striatum. So if we look at the ventral striatum of teenagers in MRIs, it is very active, way much active compared to the other brains of people in different ages. At ang epekto nito sa behavior dahil sobrang active ng ventral striatum ng mga teenagers na ito, merong natural cravings ang mga teenagers for risky behaviors. Kaya nga tuwing teenage years, napakalakas ng hatak ng mga quote-unquote pleasurable activities. Paninigarilyo, sex, gambling, tataka sa magulang, maghahanap ng adventure. Again, all these are being felt by the teenager because yung kanilang ventral striatum is very active during this time. So, ang isang teenager na puro ganyan ang mga behaviors, hindi sila sinapian ng masamang spirito. Hindi masama yung kanilang ugali. It's just that yung brain talaga nila is making them crave for these things. Pero syempre hindi excuse yan para hayaan na lang yung mga teenagers to do what they want. Pero ang natural na dapat gawin dyan aalalayan, tuturuan yung teenagers kung paano ba i-manage yung emotions that they feel, especially during this period of their life. At sino gagawa niyan? Yung adult brain. Kaya lagi ko sinasabi sa mga DevPsych classes ko, a teenage brain must be managed by an adult brain. In abnormal psychology, marami rin tayong examples dyan na malaki ang kinalaman ng brain sa pag-iisip ng tao. Like for example, yung mga serial killers. Alam naman natin na merong mali sa kanilang pag-iisip. Pero bakit mali yung kanilang pag-iisip? The way they think about killing, the way how they do their killing, maling-mali At bakit? Meron yung kinalaman sa kanilang brain activity. Halimbawa, itong si Ted Bundy, sinabi niya sa isang interview, you learn what you need to kill and take care of the details. It's like changing a tire. The first time you're careful, by the 30th time, you can't remember where you left the lug wrench. Dito pa lang sa mga salita ni Ted Bundy, alam mo na something is not right. Because you are not supposed, number one, to kill. Killing is bad. It's an immoral behavior. Pero dito sa salita ni Ted Bundy, 30 times na siyang pumatay. 'Di ba? Parang if you're going to summarize the words of Ted Bundy, ang sinasabi niya dito, masasanay ka rin na pumatay. Kapag naka-30 ka na, unti-unti gumagaling kang pumatay. Now, these are the words of someone whose brain is not normal. We all know that. Kasi ang taong normal, isipin mo lang napapatay ka, talagang pagpapawisan ka niyan. You will feel bad. Yung iba nga, masusuka, madidiri sa sarili kapag naisip nilang papatay sila ng ibang tao, but not for these people. Not for the serial killers, not for the psychopaths. Question, why are they able to talk this way? Bakit ganito ang kanilang pag-iisip about killing? Merong kinalaman sa kanilang utak. Like for example, in this study, talagang ni-research ng mga authors na ito yung mga utak ng mga psychopaths. And they have studied here hundreds of brains of psychopaths, and they came to a conclusion that one of the major reasons why psychopaths do what they do has something to do with their brain, specifically their emotion centers. Maraming mga psychopaths pala, yung emotions nila hindi gumagana. Literal, hindi sila nakakaramdam ng empathy, hindi sila nakakaramdam ng guilt or ng remorse. Kapag sinilip mo yung utak ng mga psychopaths, let's say in MRI, yung kanilang emotional centers, the limbic system is literally dead. It's not lighting up compared to the normal brain, which explains why these people are not emotionally affected by what they do. So hindi totoo na yung mga psychopaths ay kampo ng mga demonyo. No, kaya nila nagagawa yung mga ginagawa nila, kaya sila ganun mag-isip about killing other people. It has something to do with the limbic system. Pero ito, malaki itong malaki ang implication yan, for example, in the field of legal issues. Halimbawa, meron tayong psychopath na nahuli. Ibig sabihin ba nun, kailangan natin siyang bigyan ng treatment at hindi parusahan? At marami na mga attorneys ang gumawa niyan. Yung kliyente nila, psychopath. So, ang ginawa ng attorney, ang strategy para hindi maparusahan yung kliyente, the insanity plea. Ibig sabihin ng insanity plea, patutunayan mo sa korte na yung kliyente mo ay wala sa tamang pag-iisip, sira ang kanyang brain, kaya niya nagawa yung krimen. If the attorney is successful in establishing that, marami mga cases pinakawalan. Hindi pala pinakawalan, pero hindi binigyan ng parusa yung mga psychopaths na yan. Ang ginawa, nilagay sa mental institution, pero hindi pinarusahan. Pero syempre, mahirap tanggapin yon, lalo na if you are one of the family members of the victim. Gusto mo kasi parusahan yung taong yon, di ba? Pero yun na nga, ang magiging shield niya against the punishment, against legal punishment is the reason of mental disorder. So madugo, no? That's a very thorny issue in the field of abnormal psychology and law. Kinakailangan ba nating parusahan ang taong sira ang brain, or kinakailangan natin silang dalhin sa mental institution after they committed the crime? Okay, another example is autism. Alam naman natin na yung autism, itong mga simptomas na nakikita nyo sa screen nyo, all of these things are happening because of brain abnormalities. Like for example, there is a certain part of the brain, ang tawag nila dyan, mirror neurons. Parang salamin, di ba? Pag mirror neurons, ibig sabihin, ito yung mga neurons that enables you to read social cues. Nagigets mo na yung taong kausap mo galit sa'yo. Nagigets mo na kinakailangan tumigil ka na sa pagsasalita kasi yung tao nababad trip na. 'Di ba? It is a part of the brain that enables you to form social relationships. Ang problema kapag may autism, yung mirror neurons hindi gumagana. So hindi makabasa ng mga social cues yung mga tao na mayroong autism. Kasi nga yung kanilang mirror neurons ay mayroong problema at hindi gumagana. So lahat ng sinabi ko support the answer to that question, does brain shape cognition? The answer is yes. Hindi natin maitatanggi yan. Yung takbo ng pag-iisip natin may kinalaman yan sa mga biological processes inside us. Punta na tayo doon sa mas madugong sagot na not always. Ibig sabihin, meron tayong mga cognitive processes na ginagawa na walang kinalaman, walang control yung ating biological processes, specifically brain processes. One good example, yung pag-aaral na ginawa sa mga utak ng mga taxi drivers in London. Napaka-classic na study to, no? Kinumpara ng mga authors na ito yung utak ng mga London taxi drivers sa mga utak ng London bus drivers. The main difference between the taxi drivers and the bus drivers is yung mga taxi drivers, mas marami silang alam na ruta. Kasi bawat customer nila, bawat pasahero nila, iba-iba ng pinupuntahan. So, ang nangyayari, walang fixed na ruta ang pagiging isang taxi driver. Depende kung saan pupunta yung kanilang pasahero. Kaya napipilitan itong mga taxi drivers na ito na i-memorize yung iba't ibang shortcuts doon sa London. Ang London, magulong syudad yan, no, in terms of the roads. Napaka-complex nung road system yan. Kaya marami kang dapat ma-memorize na ruta para maging successful taxi driver ka sa London. Pero yung mga bus drivers in London, they don't have to memorize all these roads because yung ruta nila fixed na. 'Di ba pag bus driver ka, isang ruta lang 'yan, ikot-ikot ka lang sa ruta na 'yan. Yun ang pinagkaiba ng nature of work ng bus drivers versus taxi drivers. Ang tanong ngayon, given that they have different natures of their jobs, given that mas marami kang i-memorize na daan, kapag ikaw ay taxi driver, may pinagkaiba ba yung utak ng isang taxi driver kumpara sa utak ng isang bus driver? Napag-alaman nila by memorizing these complex roads in London, merong biological effect na nangyayari sa brain. Specifically, nung tinignan nila, nung pinag-aralan nila yung mga utak ng mga taxi drivers, ang daming gray matters. Ang daming gray matters doon sa part of the brain responsible for spatial reasoning, specifically yung hippocampus. So bakit marami yung gray matter? Bakit marami yung white matter? Ano ang cause nun? Ang cause nun, lagi nilang iniisip yung iba't ibang mga ruta ng kanilang mga pasahero. Okay? So hindi siya baliktad, no? Hindi yung tumaas mo na yung white and gray matter, tsaka sila nakamemorize ang mga ruta. It's the other way around. Nauna muna yung cognitive process, no? Nauna muna yung cognitive process, memorize sila ng memorize ang mga daan, yun ngayon yung nagpabago doon sa structure of the brain. Pinataas nung cognitive process na yon yung white and gray matter. Yung mga utak naman ng mga bus drivers, ibang-iba. Kumpara dito sa mga utak ng taxi drivers, bus drivers have very low levels of white and gray matters in their hippocampus. Kasi nga, they don't have to memorize that much of roads because they are bus drivers. Ganon din naman sa meditation studies. Isa rin yan sa mga common na pinag-aaralan in cognitive neuroscience. Ano ba ang nagiging behavior ng brain whenever a person meditates? So, ang perfect na tool para pag-aralan yung utak ng nagme-meditate is fMRI. And according to fMRI studies, if you compare yung estado ng utak ng tao before he or she meditates, very different from while the person or even after the person meditates. Ibang-iba, nag-iiba yung electrical activity. Now again, anong nauna? Yung pagbabago sa electrical activity o yung meditation? Yung meditation muna, which is a cognitive process. Nag-meditate yung monk. Ano nangyari? Nagbago yung electrical activity nung brain after that monk meditated. Hindi baliktad. Hindi yung nagkataon na yung brain naging ganyan, naging mas relax yung brain, yun yung nagpa-meditate sa monk. Hindi. Conscious effort ito nung monk. Nag-meditate siya, making his brain behave that way. Nauna yung cognition bago yung brain changes. At syempre, wag natin kakalimutan yung experience ng in love, 'di ba? Yung nai-in love ka sa isang tao. Marami mga cognitive neuroscientists sinasabi na ang love daw is just a matter of neurochemical activities in the body. Sabi nila oxytocin daw 'yan eh. Kaya raw in love ka dahil mataas ang level of oxytocin mo. Now, honestly, let's study the two proposals here. Dalawa kasi yung pwedeng possibilities dito, no, about falling in love. Ano yung mas nagme-make sense? Number one, did you fall in love because of your hormones? That's a good question. Diba? Kaya ka ba na in love doon sa taong yon? Kasi nagkataon na nung nakita mo yung taong yon, okay, mataas yung oxytocin mo kaya ka na in love? Is that it? Or is it you shared experiences with that person, nagkakuhaan kayo ng number, tapos kumain kayo sa labas, nagkopi kayo, nagkwentuhan kayo, o nagpupunta kayo sa mall, nagpupunta kayo sa mga theme parks, yung lahat ng experiences na yon, yun ngayon yung nagpataas ng oxytocin level ng tao, at dahil doon, the more that person fell in love with the other. So, alin dito yung mas nagme-make sense? Alin dito yung sinusuportahan ng maraming researches on falling in love? The answer, it's the second one. 'Di ba? Yung pagtaas ng oxytocin is the effect of falling in love and not the cause. Okay? So, nung na-in love ka, yun ang nagpataas ng oxytocin mo. Hindi baliktad. Hindi yung nagkataon tumaas ang oxytocin mo at yung unang taong nakita mo, doon ka na in love. Hindi. So, if you want to fall in love, that means you need to work for it. 'Di ba? You need to do things to increase the oxytocin and reinforce yung nararamdaman mo doon sa taong yun. So, hindi ang pagiging in love, yung pag-fall natin sa isang tao, hindi siya na ipapaliwanag ng neurochemical changes lang. 'Di ba? Masyadong complex ang experience ng love para i-reduce mo yan sa mga hormonal changes lang. Kaya kung babasahin mo yung mga love songs natin ngayon 'di ba? Marami talagang mga songwriters nagtatanong sila what love is all about, kasi imposibleng ito is just a neurochemical substance inside your body. Paano nangyayari yun? Mahal mo yung isang tao, yung isang taong yun mahal ka rin. Paano yun? Nagkataon sabay tumaas yung oxytocin nyo, tapos nagkatitigan kayo, tapos ngayon mag-asawa na kayo? Hindi. Love is more than just neurochemical changes in the body. 'Di ba? Kaya maraming mga hypothesis yung mga songwriters 'Di ba? Halimbawa, itong si David Pomeranz, tinatanong niya, that I was born for you, it was written in the stars. Yes, I was born for you and the choice was never ours. Paano nangyari yun? 'Di ba? Ano yung nagpa-inlove sa atin? Definitely hindi ito neurochemical. Yung isa pang kanta ni David Pomeranz, gusto ko rin to, yung Got to Believe in Magic. 'Di ba? Mahal kita, mahal mo rin ako. Ano yun? Neurochemical lang yun? Dahil yan sa mga oxytocin natin, hindi makapaniwala si David Pomeranz dyan. Kaya ang hypothesis niya, siguro magic ito. Siguro magic. Kaya ka na in love sa isang tao kasi merong something na nagpa-in love sa'yo, but definitely hindi lang ito neurochemical activity. Love is such a very deep human experience that it is so impossible that this complex experience is just a neurochemical activity inside your body. Kaya, lahat ng mga sinabi ko sa inyo, mga examples na 'di ba, ang tinatakil natin dito is hindi sa lahat ng pagkakataon yung ating cognition, it's based on the brain. So the conclusion here is cognition can also shape the brain. Brain can shape cognition, pero pwede rin yung baliktad. Cognition, our choice to do cognitive activities, meron din yung epekto sa ating pag-iisip. At ang malaking implication yan is kung yung cognition natin merong epekto sa brain natin. Okay? We are not always the slaves of our brain activities. Malaki ang problema ng reductionism. Reductionism, ito ay isang paniniwala sa cognitive neuroscience where sinasabi nila na lahat ng ating mga cognitive processes ay pwede mong ipaliwanag through biological processes. You reduce, kaya nga yung term na reductionism from the word reduce, you reduce those complex cognition into smaller biological processes. Pero yung ebidensya nga na ang cognition pa nga yung nagpapabago sa brain, not the other way around, puts question into this idea. Kahit yung brain size argument nagiging problemado. Marami mga cognitive neuroscientists, lalong-lalo na yung naniniwala sa evolution, sinasabi nila na lahat ng psychological experiences natin can be explained by the size of our brain. 'Di ba? Yung pagiging in love mo, yung pagiging aware mo sa sarili mo, yung decision making processes mo, lahat 'yan posible kasi yung utak mo malaki. Ganun lang kasimple yung explanation nila. Because you have enough brain cells that you can perform all those cognitive processes. Kaya hindi ka pa raw tao nung Australopithecus ka pa lang kasi yung brain mo maliit pa lang. Wala ka pang genuine human experience. Naging tao ka lang daw noong nag-homo habilis ka na kasi lumaki na yung brain mo. Kaya kung gusto mong maging tao, kinakailangan yung brain natin ay lumaki ng lumaki in the process of evolution. Now, there's a problem in that argument. Paano naman yung mga organism sa mundo na mas malaki pa ang utak kumpara sa tao? For example, the African bush elephant. Halos doble ang laki ng utak niyan kumpara sa mga tao. Pero lahat naman tayo agree dito na mas matalino pa rin yung tao. No? Na yung experiences nating bilang mga tao, pagiging in love, we are in awe of God's presence, our ability to worship God, lahat yan, unique sa atin yan. Unless may kakilala kayong African bush elephant na bumoboto na. O kaya sumasamba sa Diyos. O kaya, meron siyang idea of how the economy works. Definitely wala. So wala sa brain size yan. 'Di ba? So yun ang problema doon sa brain size argument. Okay? So pero gusto kong i-emphasize to, no? Ang pinakamalakas na argument against reductionism, that everything that we can experience right now psychologically can be explained by brain processes, is the idea, it's the finding in cognitive neuroscience that consciousness is not created or even located in the brain. Sa Tagalog, kamalayan. Nasaan yung kamalayan sa brain? Anong part ng brain nag-handle sa kamalayan? Ang sagot, wala. 'Di ba? When we talk about consciousness, aware ka na buhay ka, aware ka na nakikinig ka sa akin ngayon. Meron kang mga dreams in the future, aware ka rin doon, napapunta ka doon. Aware ka rin na palayo ka na doon sa mga past experiences mo. All of these are consciousness. Pero anong part ng brain ang nag-handle ng consciousness? Wala. Cognitive neuroscientists up until today cannot find the specific part of the brain that handles consciousness. It's as if, based on this picture that you can see, ito yung model talaga ng brain Yung consciousness natin, it's possible it's outside the brain. It's not being controlled by the brain because it is outside the brain. It is that consciousness that affects the brain. So yung taong nakaupo doon sa utak, yan ngayon yung nakakaapekto doon sa brain. Posible na yung mga ginagawa ng taong yan yung nagkokos ng mga brain changes na pinag-aralan natin kanina sa mga previous slides ko. If you are into this kind of finding, basahin nyo yung sinulat na article ni François Tonneau entitled Consciousness Outside the Head. Ang thought lang naman dito ng author, sinasabi niya that something else is driving the brain. Again, it is not only the brain. It is not always the brain that drives our cognition, but something else is driving the brain. It's possible that it is the cognition that drives the brain. Yun na nga yung tao, no, na sinasabi natin dito. Siya yung tao na yon na nagdadrive ng brain, and there are things that this person does. May mga ginagawa siya na nakakaapekto doon sa structure ng brain na inuupuan niya. Pero ito ang tanong, ano kaya yung something na yun? What is that something that may affect the structure of the brain? Anong tawag natin doon sa taong nakaupo sa brain na yan? Well, we need to go back to our roots to answer that question in the field of psychology. Yan yung tinatawag nating psyche na pinag-aaralan sa psychology. Pero para sa mga nakakalimot na mga psych majors, Ano bang ibig sabihin ng psyche na pinag-aaralan sa psychology? Ang origin ng salitang yan is breath, spirit, or soul. Again nakita nyo naman dito sa red box, it's not the brain. Psychology is not the scientific study of the brain. That's neurology in the field of medicine. Right? Psychology is not a branch of medicine. So ang pinag-aaralan natin sa psychology, yung psyche, na ang pinakaibig sabihin pala ay breath, spirit, and soul. It's not the brain. There is a psyche inside the brain. Saan ba nanggaling yung psyche na yan? Ang Biblia ang sasagot dyan. Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 is very clear. Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils, the breath of life, and man became a living being. Naging buhay lang yung tao, naging living being lang yung tao nung merong pumasok sa kanya. And what was that? The breath of life coming from God. In other words, the psyche entered the person and that made the person a living being. You see, that word, breath of life, yan ang origin ng salitang psyche in this slide. That breath from God that entered the body of human beings that made it a living being, that's the breath, the psyche, the spirit, the soul that we study in the field of psychology. So yan yung nakakaapekto sa utak ng tao, yung psyche na yon, yung ating spirito. Yun yung nakakaapekto sa structure ng brain natin. Is it possible na yung mga sinabi kong mga changes in the brain based on cognition kanina, yun yung mga footprints nung spirit na sinasabi ng Biblia? That's very possible. That the reason why all these things are happening to the physical structures of our brain, it's because that psyche that we have is at work. Kapag may ginagawa yung psyche na yon, nakakaapekto yung mga ginagawa niya sa physical structure of the brain. At marami na mga pag-aaral dyan na talagang sinusuportahan yung ganyang model of understanding the psyche, no? Like this book by Steve Taylor na ang title ay Spiritual Science. I highly recommend that you read this book. Marami mga pag-aaral dito nagpapatunay na meron talagang psyche na nakakaapekto sa structure of the brain. Basahin ko sa inyo yung ibang excerpts coming from this study. In a 2011 study, a group of 16 new meditators were given brain scans before and after an 8-week meditation program. After meditating for an average of 27 minutes each day for 8 weeks, the scan showed a significantly greater amount of gray matter throughout many regions of the brain. Similarly, a 2017 study found that cognitive behavioral therapy can cause significant neurological changes. Focusing on a group of people who were suffering from psychosis, researchers found that a 12-week course of CBT brought about increased connections in the amygdala and frontal lobes, which the researchers associated with rational thinking. Focus kayo doon sa mga words in red. Anong sinabi? Ang cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of cognition, diba? Merong epekto sa physical structure of the brain. Kapag in-apply mo raw yung mga tinuturo sa CBT, literal, yung structure ng brain nagbabago. Very very connected sa biological psychology term, the plasticity of the brain. That the brain can change its structure. Question, who does that? The brain cannot do that to itself. It's not the brain who decided to change its form. Rather, something else other than the brain was at work. May ginagawa yung psyche, yun ngayon yung nagpapabago doon sa structure of the brain. Now, let me read this for you. Very important. How could any of this be possible if mental phenomena are just the product of brain activity? How can an epiphenomenon change the nature of the primary thing it's just a byproduct of? In reductionism, the mind is seen as a shadow of the brain. And how can a shadow change the object that it's the shadow of? Or, in Huxley's analogy, how could a steam whistle change the nature of the engine itself? Yan yung tinatanong ng sumulat ng spiritual science. The brain cannot decide for itself that it should change its structure. So merong isang higher force than the physical brain that causes all these changes. Ganon din naman sa placebo effects, no? Pinag-aaralan din yan doon sa spiritual science na libro. Kung maalala niyo, yung placebo effect happens when something you take into your body is not really effective, but for some reason, people who take that something experience effects from that something. Wala naman talagang epekto yung kapsula na ininom mo. Pero nung ininom mo, gumaling yung sakit mo. Bakit? Kasi pinaniwala ka nung experimenter na yung kapsulang ininom mo, meron talagang epekto sa katawan mo. So that belief, yung paniniwalang epektibo, yung kapsula na kinain mo, sapat na yon para makaranas ka talaga ng mga epekto sa iyong pangangatawan. Yun yung tinatawag nating placebo effect. And placebo effects support the model of a psyche, of a spirit that is over the brain. Let me read for you. Sinabi ulit ito sa spiritual science. This phenomenon, yung placebo effect, was first noted in the mid-20th century when scientists began to use double-blind, randomized controlled trials in research. This meant that a procedure or treatment would be carried out with two groups. One group that would actually receive the treatment and another, the control group, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina, that would receive inert substances. Ito yung mga substances na wala naman talagang epekto, but people were made to believe that these substances are really effective. Anong nakita nila? In medical trials, researchers began to find that for some unknown reason, the control groups, yung kumain ng inert substance, yung wala talagang epekto, would report some effect, that their symptoms had alleviated or that pain had faded away even though they had actually had no treatment. In some cases, the control group would even report negative side effects of the treatment. Over the course of decades of research, a vast array of different conditions have been shown to benefit from placebos. Ano ang mga sakit na kayang gamutin ng placebo effect? Aba, matitindi, acne, Crohn's disease, epilepsy, erectile dysfunction, ulcers, multiple sclerosis, osteoarthritis, rheumatism, and colitis. Biruin nyo yun. Mga big time na mga sakit yan, pero kayang gamutin ng belief ng psyche. Basta ang psyche maniwala na itong gamot na ito ay epektibo sa pangangatawan. The psyche can fool, quote-unquote, can fool the brain and the body to believe that it is actually healed. Diba? So, in a more theological terms, ang tawag dito, the spiritual ability of belief, the power of belief. And marami na mga libro na nasusulat dyan na ang paniniwala ng tao, it's so powerful that it can even transcend the ability of the body to respond in a certain way. Siguro, mas magandang term sa belief, kung medyo gagawin nating biblical ang term, ito yung tinatawag nating faith o pananampalataya, matinding paniniwala. Diba? Yan yung ibig sabihin ng faith. At yan yung isang spiritual skill na talagang paulit-ulit na kinukulit sa atin ng Biblia. Napalakasin natin ang ating pananampalataya. Now, is it possible that placebo and faith are connected? Is it possible that placebo effects na nakita doon sa mga binasa ko kanina are evidences that faith is real? Yung psyche na nagkokontrol sa brain natin, meron siyang faith, at yung faith ng psyche natin can fool our brain to experience certain things na hindi naman natin dapat na-experience. Ako, I believe, totoo yan. Diba? Remember, there was a passage in the Bible where Jesus said, if you have a faith as a grain, or as small as a grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Could it be that that is faith? Could it be the reason why placebo effects are observed? It's because of that faith, the ability to have faith by our psyche. In another story in the New Testament, gustong-gusto ko rin to, no? I think placebo effect can be observed in this story. You remember the story of the woman. Meron siyang sakit for 12 years. She's bleeding. Nabalitaan niya si Kristo parating sa kanyang lugar. Meron siyang matinding paniniwala. Hindi naman kinakailangan na gamutin ako face to face si Jesus Christ para maging magaling yung aking karamdaman. All I need to do is to be able to hold a piece of His clothing and I will be healed. Ganun katindi yung pananampalataya ng babaeng ito. Mahawakan lang niya yung isang part ng damit ni Jesus, she will be healed. And so to make the long story short, gumawa siya ng paraan, sumingit-singit siya doon sa maraming tao while Jesus was walking and she was successful. Nahawakan niya yung isang part ng clothing ni Jesus. And when that happened, she was healed. But Jesus felt that. 'Di ba? Doon sa story, bigla siyang huminto, tinanong niya, "Who touched me?" O, 'di ba? Nagulat yung mga disciples niya, yung mga tao, "Lord, bakit niyo tinatanong 'yan? Kanina pa tayo tinutulak-tulak dito." And then you will ask, "Who touched you?" Sabi ni Jesus, "Hindi, because I felt power flowed out from me." Sabi niya. Nung nakita ng babae na naramdaman ni Jesus yung kanyang ginawa, umamin na siya. So the woman called Jesus' attention and then told him everything that happened. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. And then look at what Jesus said. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Sounds familiar? Hindi ba kahalintulad yan nung mga binasa natin kanina na naniwala sila na meron itong epekto sa kanila? Mawawala yung kanilang mga sakit. They had faith, and that faith healed their bodies. In the same way, in the same statement that Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Oh, yung faith ba? Nasa brain ba yon? Diba? Wala naman yung faith sa brain. Walang certain part of the brain that handles faith. Because faith is something that is performed by the psyche that is outside the brain. So in conclusion, doon sa spiritual science, basahin ko lang, it appears that even now, most scientists don't grasp the full implications of the placebo effect. That the human mind has the capacity to powerfully influence almost any aspect of our physiology, including the healing of many conditions and the alleviation of a large range of symptoms. And in turn, this implies that the mind is actually primary to the physical stuff of our bodies and brains rather than a byproduct of brain activity. Grabe, no? Yan ngayon ang common conclusion ng mga cognitive neuroscientists. There is something other than the brain that affects our cognition. At yun yung tinatawag nating psyche. So as we close this video, grabe, ang dami natin na pag-aralan ngayon, no? Isa-summarize ko lang yung mga key points na dapat nyong naalala on our short discussion today. Number 1, cognition is real. Hindi ito gawa-gawa lang ng mga psychologist. Totoong meron tayong mga mental actions na nangyayari which makes life possible for us. We make decisions, we plan inside our heads, nagme-mental computation tayo, nag-i-imagine tayo, nagpapantasya tayo. Cognition is real. At yan ang pinag-aaralan sa cognitive psychology and in cognitive neuroscience. Number 2, some cognitions are brain controlled. Totoo yun. Meron tayong takbo ng pag-iisip. Ganon ang takbo ng pag-iisip natin dahil merong something sa ating brain. Merong something sa ating biological processes. Hindi natin pwedeng i-deny yan. Kaya merong mga cognition na palpak, merong mga cognition na hindi maganda, in a way, hindi talaga kasalanan ng tao yan. Talagang meron lang mali sa kanyang biological elements. Number 3, most cognitions are brain independent. Mas marami yung mga cognitions na ginagawa natin na walang kinalaman yung brain. Kung walang kinalaman ang brain, sino ang gumagawa ng mga cognition na yon? It's the psyche. Merong mga cognitions, ang tawag ko dyan, mga psyche-controlled cognitions. Huwag natin i-deny yan kasi matibay ang ebidensya na ito ay totoo. And last one, number 4, and I think ito yung pinaka-good news ng ating lecture today, the psyche is the master of the brain, not the other way around. Bakit good news yan? Because this confirms na ang tao meron talagang free will. Hindi tayo slaves, hindi tayo helpless sa mga bagay na nararamdaman natin o iniisip natin. Kasi may mga tao ganyan meron silang parang victim attitude mindset. No? Sinasabi nila, wala na akong magagawa, ganito na talaga yung brain ko Wala na akong magagawa kasi ito yung genetic makeup ko Wala na akong magagawa kasi yung ganitong part ng brain ko sira Hindi pala totoo yan. Remember, meron tayong brain plasticity. The brain can change its structure. It can improve through the actions that is being done by the psyche. At yung psyche na yon, siya yung may hawak ng free will. So the psyche practices the will, the psyche does the cognitive actions, and in the process, yung mga cognitive actions na ginagawa ng psyche, yun ngayon yung nagpapabago doon sa structure of the brain. So it's all about the psyche. Are we willing to change our brains? It just takes a matter of decision and will. Kung walang free will, wag na tayo mag-cognitive psychology. Diba? Totoo yun Kaya nga sabi ko, good news yung number 4. Diba? Kung lahat pala to, nakasalalay lang sa brain natin, nakasalalay lang sa neurochemicals natin, wag na tayong mag-cognitive psychology. Mag-biological psychology na lang tayo. But remember, ang mental actions, free will. We can choose how to think. We can choose what to think. Kasi hindi naman brain ang gumagawa nun. It's the psyche. And the psyche is who we are. Okay? The psyche affects our brain. Kaya magandang balita yan. Kung meron man tayong mga problema sa ating cognition, meron tayong mga faulty reasoning, meron tayong mga maling perspective sa buhay, the good news, it just takes a matter of will para baguhin mo yung mga kamalian na yon sa iyong pag-iisip. Okay? I want to share with you what the Bible is saying about cognition. Be careful about what you think because your thoughts run your life. Kaya ang Biblia ang kulit-kulit Marami sinasabi about cognition. Paano mag-isip ng tama? Bakit ang Bible, inuutusan tayo na mag-isip ng tama? Kasi nasa control natin yan. Kung ang Biblia, kung ang cognition wala sa control natin, hindi na tayo kukulitin ng Biblia. Siguro, le-lecturean na lang tayo ng Biblia kung ano nangyayari sa neurochemical changes sa katawan natin. Pero hindi because the Bible knows that it is not the brain that controls us, rather it is the psyche that controls a large chunk of our life. The Bible talks about a lot of things about the psyche. The Bible keeps on teaching people how to think the right way. Diba? Yun ang sinasabi ng cognitive neuroscience. So sana marami kayong natutunan. Kung meron kayo mga questions, comment lang kayo sa baba and I'm going to do my best to answer your questions. Okay, so let's call it a day. Thank you everyone for listening. Until next time, Sir Howard here.